I want to tell you about the phone call that changed everything. Not the one I made, the one I received. At 7:40 on a Tuesday morning, standing in a hospital parking garage in Nashville, with a cold cup of coffee in one hand and my mother's insurance paperwork in the other. The voice on the line was calm, professional, unhurried. It belonged to a woman named Patricia Weston, a private estate attorney I had never spoken to before in my life. She said she was calling on behalf of my mother, Joanna Gaines. She said she had been trying to reach me for 3 days. She said there were documents I needed to see before the end of the week. She said, "Your brothers filed a legal guardianship petition 4 days ago. If it's approved, you'll no longer have any say in your mother's care or her estate." I stood in that parking garage for a long time after the call ended. Long enough that a man in a pickup truck honked at me twice because I was standing in the middle of the lane. I moved. I sat on a concrete curb next to a support column, and I stayed there until I could feel my hands again. My name is Joanna Gaines. Yes, like the other one, I've heard every joke. And I am 43 years old. I'm a high school English teacher in Nashville, Tennessee. I have 2 older brothers, Darren and Scott. And for most of my adult life, the 3 of us existed in the kind of peaceable family distance that develops when people grow up together and then grow apart without ever having a serious falling out. Holidays together, phone calls on birthdays, a group text that mostly went quiet for weeks at a time. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have suggested to any outside observer that we were the kind of family capable of what came next. My mother, Eleanor, was 71 years old, and she had been my person since the beginning. She was a retired librarian who still read 2 books a week, who made her own bread, who could identify 47 species of birds by their calls, and who had spent her entire adult life making the people around her feel more capable than they actually were. When my marriage ended 5 years ago, she drove 6 hours to sit with me for a week without once asking what had gone wrong, because she understood that sometimes you don't need questions, you need presence. When I got the teaching job I'd wanted for 3 years, she cried harder than I did. She was also, in the last 2 years, showing the early signs of memory loss. Not severe, not constant, but real. Moments of confusion that cleared, names that got tangled, a few incidents that frightened her more than they frightened us. Her neurologist called it mild cognitive decline and told us to monitor it carefully, to maintain routine, to keep her in familiar environments, and to avoid disrupting her life structure unnecessarily. I had taken that advice seriously. I visited every 3 weeks. I helped her manage her medications. I set up a calendar system on her phone and walked her through it, on video call every Sunday morning. I had taken 2 weeks off work in February, when she had a UTI that temporarily worsened her confusion and needed more support. I knew her doctors by name. I knew her neighbour Patricia's number by heart. I knew which lamp she left on at night and which door she locked last before bed. My brothers knew she lived on Sycamore Lane. That's not entirely fair to Scott. He called regularly, and he had visited twice in the past year, which was more than Darren had managed. But neither of them had been involved in the way that I had been involved, which I want to say clearly was never a source of resentment for me. I wasn't keeping score. My mother needed someone nearby, and I was the one who was nearby, and I was glad to be that person. I didn't do it for acknowledgement or credit. I did it because she was my mother, and she had spent 43 years doing things for me, and this was my turn. What I didn't know, what I found out on that concrete curb in a hospital parking garage, was that my brothers had been having conversations I wasn't part of. The nursing home was called Sunrise Gardens. It was 45 minutes from Darren's house, which was 4 hours from my mother's house, and 6 hours from mine. Darren had toured it in January. He had put down a deposit in February, the same week I was at my mother's house managing her illness. He had not mentioned this to me, not then, not in March, when he called to ask how she was doing, not in April, when we'd all been on a video call together for her birthday, and she had laughed at something Scott said and seemed by any observable measure genuinely fine. The guardianship petition had been filed 8 days ago. The legal argument, as Patricia Weston explained to me over the phone that morning, was that my mother was no longer capable of managing her own affairs and required a designated guardian to make decisions on her behalf. The petition named Darren as primary guardian. It described my mother's condition in language that I barely recognised. Severe cognitive deterioration, inability to manage daily functions, risk to her own safety in independent living. Language that was not supported by her most recent neurological evaluation, which I had attended in March, and which had noted, specifically, that she was functioning well within expected parameters for mild age-related cognitive change. The other thing Patricia Weston told me was that my mother had called her herself 2 weeks ago because a neighbour had mentioned guardianship proceedings after overhearing a conversation between Darren and someone at her house. My mother had looked up estate attorneys in Nashville, found Patricia Weston, and made the call independently. She had explained what she'd heard. She had asked what her options were. She had specifically asked whether she could ensure her own wishes were protected, regardless of what her sons decided to do. Patricia Weston told me my mother had been entirely lucid during that call. Clear, specific, and precise. Joanna Gaines had then asked Patricia to reach out to me. I drove straight to my mother's house from the parking garage. 4 hours. I stopped once for gas and didn't get back in the car for 10 minutes because I needed to stand in the cold air and breathe. I spent the drive thinking about February, about sitting in my mother's kitchen at 2 a.m, when she was confused and frightened from the fever. Holding her hand, telling her I was there. I thought about the deposit Darren had put down while I was doing that. I thought about the language in the guardianship petition. Severe cognitive deterioration. I thought about who benefits when a parent is declared legally incapable of managing her own affairs, and what happens to an estate when that declaration is in place. My mother's house, the one she had lived in for 34 years, sat on 3 acres in a part of the county where property values had increased significantly in the past decade. She also had a retirement account that my father had contributed to for 31 years before he died. Neither of those things was information I had ever thought about in terms of what they were worth. Not once. I was beginning to think my brothers had. My mother was in her garden when I pulled up, which was both the most Eleanor thing possible and also, under the circumstances, something that made me want to sit down on her lawn and cry. She was deadheading her roses with the small pair of red-handled clippers she'd had since I was in middle school. She looked up when I got out of the car and said, "I thought you might come," which is the kind of sentence that sounds ordinary and means everything. We sat in her kitchen and she told me what she'd heard. Darren had been at the house in March, a visit she hadn't mentioned to me because she hadn't wanted to worry me while I was at work. He had walked through the house with someone she didn't know and talked about modifications. He had said something about it being better for everyone if she were somewhere with more support. She had nodded along because she didn't fully understand what was happening, but something about it had unsettled her enough that when her neighbour mentioned the word guardianship a week later, she'd gone inside and looked it up. "I'm not confused, Joanna," she said, looking at me over her kitchen table with the complete directness she had carried her entire life. "I have bad days, but I know who I am, and I know what I want, and I know that nobody asked me." Patricia Weston met us at her office in Nashville 2 days later, and I want to tell you that the 2 hours I spent in that office were some of the most clarifying hours of my adult life. Patricia was in her 50s, practical, unflappable, and had clearly been in this specific situation before. She explained the legal landscape quickly and plainly. She told my mother what the petition claimed and what it would mean if approved. She told her what the counter options were. She told her that a person with capacity has the right to designate their own decision-making authority and to contest a guardianship filing that misrepresents their condition. My mother listened to all of it, asked 3 specific questions, and then said, "Tell me where to sign." Joanna Gaines signed a durable power of attorney designating me as her legal decision-maker in the event she was unable to make decisions for herself. She signed a healthcare directive that specified her wishes in detail. She signed a letter of objection to the guardianship petition that Patricia had drafted, supported by a statement from her neurologist's office clarifying her actual diagnosis and current functional status. And she signed a document updating her estate plan, which, as it turned out, Darren and Scott had both assumed named them as primary beneficiaries, and which my mother quietly, and apparently with great forethought, had already revised 2 years earlier. The guardianship hearing was 3 weeks later. Darren arrived with an attorney. Scott arrived looking like a man who had only recently understood the full scope of what he'd agreed to, and was now significantly less comfortable with it. My mother arrived with Patricia Weston and me, wearing her good blue cardigan, carrying her own folder of documents. The judge asked my mother directly whether she wished to contest the petition. She said yes, clearly, without hesitation, looking the judge in the eye. He asked whether she understood what the petition was requesting. She described it back to him accurately and in full. He asked whether she had executed a power of attorney of her own choosing. She said she had, and named me. The judge looked at the neurological statement. He looked at my mother's own documentation. He looked at Darren's attorney and said, in the measured tone of someone who has read a great many petitions, and has a working sense of which ones reflect genuine concern and which ones don't, that he did not find the evidentiary basis for the filing sufficient to override a competent adult's clearly expressed preferences, and that the petition was denied. Darren didn't look at me when he left the courtroom. Scott caught up with me in the hallway and said quietly that he was sorry. I told him that the person he owed the apology to was still inside. He went back in. I don't know what he said to her. That part belongs to them. My mother still lives in her house on Sycamore Lane. She has a home care aide who comes 3 mornings a week, which was already something we had been discussing before any of this happened. She still reads 2 books a week. She still makes her own bread. She called me last Sunday morning, right on schedule, to go through her calendar, and in the middle of it, she said, I want you to know I was never scared. I was angry. There's a difference. I told her I knew. Because I did. Here is what I want to say about the years I spent driving 4 hours each way, managing medications, sitting up in the middle of the night, doing the work that nobody sees and nobody thanks you for, and that I never once did in order to be thanked. I didn't do it to earn anything. I did it because she was my mother, and it was the right thing, and love doesn't require a return on investment to be real. But I will also tell you this. The people who show up when it's difficult, consistently, without an audience, without applause, without even being sure anyone is noticing, those people are not invisible. Not always. Sometimes someone notices quietly and files it away and finds a way to make sure it counts. My mother noticed. She had noticed for years, and when it mattered, she made sure the record reflected it. If you've ever been the one who shows up without being asked, and wondered whether any of it registers, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and if you stayed until the end, you already know what to do.